Hi, welcome everyone. So to those of you who joined us in our verification challenge earlier in April, welcome back. You've done the little quizzes and got a taste of what fact checking is all about. I hope you're now ready to take a deep dive into verifying content and becoming a master fact checker. Now, this workshop series is split into 6 parts. Today, we'll look at the mis and disinformation landscape. The following workshops in the subsequent days and weeks will cover the steps taken to verify content, how to dig for information, analyze sources, geolocate, and the ethics we need to have as fact checkers and journalists when pursuing our work. Now, I hope you're ready, and let's begin. So if you look at this headline and this article, it looks like it's an article published by the CNN, right? And it says here, Biden says of AstraZeneca vaccine, it's probably pretty safe, but personally, I wouldn't take it for myself. Now, how would you feel when you see this article with such a headline? And can you actually imagine the effects it would have when this is spread widely? Now, we've already been very aware of this term called vaccine hesitancy. So to have such headlines obviously distributed around would cause a lot of anxiety among people. Now, actually, the article in itself is not real, and it's made to look like a CNN report. Now, most of the people, when they forward information, especially on close messaging apps like WhatsApp or Telegram, they would probably use it as a screen grab, right? And they'll screen grab and they'll forward the photo of the headline of an article, screen grab what looks like an article, and just forward it to their friends. Perhaps a lot of people oftentimes would not even bother to look for the original article. And if there are those who did, and maybe they would say that, oh, it looks like this article does not exist. So there will also be those then that would come up to claim that, oh, but this article has been taken down. So, of course, inauthentic content is not just a problem for the public, but essentially there is this term called the UGC, and the widespread adoption of UGC means that a lot more content is being used by the media that's not being created internally, meaning that, it's created by anyone, you and me, or anyone out there. And what is UGC? UGC means user-generated content. So of course, it started in the early 2000s when we all discovered the advent of the early age of smartphones, and we can take photos and then we start to distribute them for fun, for laughs. It was basically started off as amateur content that used to appear only occasionally, and then later on, as it gained traction, some of these things go viral online, right? But as we can see right now, user-generated content has evolved a lot from what it used to be just taking photos and sharing with friends and family and then it having going viral somehow. Now it's user-generated content has become what we also known as citizen journalism, right? People have resorted to using their smartphones to record events in their neighborhood and started sharing it. And also you can see that media outlets have also now begun to rely on public's on-the-site content for its reportage. Now, of course, this is happening due to the fact that, why we need to rely on user-generated content is because newsrooms themselves are facing this constraint of, time pressure. Because especially when it's breaking news, you don't have anyone immediately on the ground. You have to rely on eyewitness provided content. And usually this would, in the age of social media, most of this is streamed to platforms such as Twitter or Facebook, right? And also because we have issues with staffing. So newsrooms facing pressure with staffing would not have an immediate reporter or a journalist or a cameraman in the city or location where an incident is happening, especially if it's not in a big city. Now, this is also because there is also a lot of competition between media outlets due to the widespread of the use of the internet. Everything means that basically consumers want things right now, as in now, not 10 seconds later, not 30 seconds later, definitely not 10 or 15 minutes later. So because of the intense competition for speed between media outlets. So they are also press, and therefore they would just resort to sometimes using external content. And also then we have this external factors, which is, you have certain characters who are using the opportunity to generate their own content to make money. And there are also interested actors, like, in terms of political parties, or, those who are ideological ones, perhaps religious parties, or even in terms of, those who just want to create mischief. So the result, when you have such public user-generated content, even by intentional or non-intentional, by those interested parties or not, what results is that we see in today's age is that we see a lot of mistakes happening when news outlets publish things without properly checking beforehand, and this has happened countless of times. We also see how news media outlets could then easily be manipulated by content that is obviously skewed or biased, but because of the time constraint and pressure and staffing and all of that, they might not have been able to check before publishing. And all of this will also result in the absolute loss of trust towards the media outlets, right? And so then the public are now unsure of who or what to believe. So does all of this matter? So isn't skepticism good overall? But the lack of trust towards the media fallouts, and the questionable state and also paid actors have made the entire information landscape very murky. So who do we trust and who can we trust now? So to answer all of that, right, first, as a responsible journalist and fact checker, we must know the basics. That is, what is the misinformation and disinformation landscape? It's important to understand this landscape before we can proceed to identifying what we call as fake news or false information. So let's quickly clarify what we mean when we want to differentiate between misinformation and disinformation. First off, misinformation is information that is false, right? Very straightforward. Disinformation, meanwhile, is information that is also false, but it is created and or disseminated with the intention to mislead or further an agenda. So the difference here between misinformation and disinformation lies in the intention itself. So with misinformation, it's a false content, but it's not necessarily created with malicious intent. But disinformation is very clear that the intent is rather negative. Of course, both can be harmful, and we saw this in recent years. Misinformation that has spread organically especially through WhatsApp, that has caused fear, panic, and mob behavior. So this we have seen, a few years ago in India, when false messages viraling through WhatsApp has caused widespread mob killing across the entire country in India. And now we also saw, as recently as last year, how when at the early days of the pandemic, where I'm sure every one of you have received that WhatsApp message on what are from friends and relatives on basically the remedy to cure COVID, or things to eat to prevent COVID infection. Of course, we know none of these remedies work right now. But in the early days, how many people, including us ourselves, how many of us were actually susceptible to forwarding such information on WhatsApp without first checking the information? So this information, meanwhile, you can see that it's purposely spread by determined and resourceful actors. And you can see the consequences of it is far more serious, right? You have hate speech, you can have propaganda, and it's spread deliberately and systematically, and is specifically done to demonize and to take action against a chosen target. And we've seen this happening in countries like Myanmar, in Ethiopia, and even in the pre-internet era in Rwanda, when we see massive violence against a certain ethnic group. Oh, of course, we can say that, it's easy to be complacent and think that communications professionals are unlikely to be caught up, meaning we as journalists would not fall prey to such foolish, tactics. But of course, however, if you start to really take notice, right, and you be very, very observant of what's being reported by even reputable news outlets out there, you realize that even the big guys make a lot of mistakes. And if you are a regular of Western media outlets, you always watch the Western news, you would see that this guy may look pretty familiar. Well, his name is Sam Hyde. His picture is posted in the aftermath of virtually every single terrorist attack, mass shooting, major accident, and other such incidents. So it actually started as a deliberate prank on the 4chan website. And Hyde is a YouTuber and comedian. And posters on 4chan decided that it would be fun to associate him falsely with such incidents. Now, sometimes they vary the joke, they would change his name to say that, oh, he's a convert to Islam and his Islamic name is Samir al-Hajid. And you would imagine that, such a prank, that people will obviously know that it's a joke and they wouldn't fall prey to it, right? And take it seriously. But then again, it has happened repeatedly. He appears on a Russian TV, and then he appears in the news in Portugal, and even in Romania. Of course, this is across Europe, of course, even in the US, he has also been cited as one of the perpetrators of a mass shooting incident.
And are you learning any more about how investigators are now piecing information together? Do you know anything about the attacker?
We don't. It was reported to me that he's actually not from this community. Apparently, his name was released as Sam Hyde. That was the name I was given.
So as you can see, that even large media outlets across the globe have fell prey to this very old prank that has been recycled over and over again. So every few years, and I think as recent as last year, during the Beirut, Lebanon blast, his name appeared again, and it was going viral on Facebook with very dubious screenshots of the New York Times quoting him as the New York Times. So it was all very dubious screenshots, but people were still sharing it on Facebook. So of course, there's also this other example, which it's a popular Twitter account a few years ago, and it was unmasked in 2017 as being a creation of a deliberate Russian disinformation operation. But not before its tweets was, not before it was exposed. This Jenna Abrams, her Twitter account has been published by many of the world's largest media outlets, and here you can see the list of media outlets that includes a lot of huge reputable names that you think that they would not fall prey to a false or a fake Twitter account, but they did. So it's important to recognize that the effects of sharing and or believing unverified information are not all negative. Of course, it can be sometimes, as a joke, it can be fun, it can be a good distraction. And when shared among friends, it can instill sense of belonging, and also then it also allows people feel empowered. And of course, on the upside is that people, when they share information, and this is what I realized, especially last year when I was getting a lot of this COVID-related WhatsApp messages that were forwarded, people often share it in the genuine belief that they are helping others without realizing that it's actually misinformation. And when I try to point it out to them, they would then tell me that, well, I didn't know, but it's better to share than not to share. So there's this common perception that that it's better for them to share than not to share. But on the downside is that a lot of people don't consider these factors, right? What are the harm that could come about by sharing this kind of information, right? It can be healthcare related. It can be scams, it can be politically related, or even tied to social ills and misconceptions. And so the spread of false information tends to follow a typical pattern. So it starts off, it begins its life form in the form of an individual creator or a small group of people who started creating this false information, and then it will often be shared through private or encrypted messaging apps like such as what we see most commonly used in Asia would be WhatsApp, Telegram, or Line, and even Facebook Messenger. And then from there, it makes its way, or in this case, a disinformation. If it's a disinformation, it would be deliberately seeded through, fringe websites. I would say fringe news sites, which is very suspicious news websites that appear out of nowhere, and especially during critically important times such as an election. So and it could also appear through blogs and social media groups that have a lot of followers. So once it has picked enough traction, basically what happens is that because it's been so widely used and so widely viral, it often generates enough eyeballs to be picked up by the mass media. And as we can see, that there is something of a dilemma, right? So as the more it spreads, the easier it becomes for you to then so-called backtrack and identify and discover where it came from. But it also becomes harder to counter or undo the damage because it has been seen by so many people. So there are therefore three main tasks faced by journalists working with with such content. Right? When you receive your content, either as an individual journalist or via a newsroom, first of all, you must be able to then to discover false content whenever or incidents whenever they take place. And you also should be able to establish a network to monitor likely sources where you see that there's a high possibility that false information would tend to generate or come out of these platforms or pages. And also they must also have the skills to enable them to verify or debunk information authoritatively. And finally, we should not forget the importance of communicating findings to the public in a convincing and transparent manner. So we must be able to iron out and say out very clearly how we came out to our conclusion after verifying the content itself. So we can see that with monitoring and discovering, so we'll need to identify where are the likely sources or platforms that are used according to different regions, according to a topic, like anti-vaxxers, where would they usually congregate, for example. And we will use tools and techniques to monitor each of this, and this will cover in the subsequent workshops what are the tools and techniques we'll need. And then also we'll use specialized searches for content, info, and sources. Again, we'll also cover this in our upcoming workshops. Next is verify. So we'll need to identify manipulated or misrepresented content. So we'll also need to verify location, dates, and times. We call this usually geolocation. And we'll need to identify corroborating or contradictory content and info and investigate the sources. So of course, in the verification process, we'll come to realize or take notice that most of these monitoring and discovery, both of it can be crucial to unearth corroborating or contradictory info. So once you've once you've amassed your content, you've done your fact checking to verify it, then you would come up with your report, which is you want to inform your audience of your findings, aiming for utmost clarity, objectivity, and transparency. And now we'll look at, okay, this is a simple workshop exercise. So I would just want you to just go through to this website called DHMO.org. And you can take a look at the information that's on the website, and you can ask yourself if the information, does it cause you to be concerned about DHMO, and you should ask yourself why or why not. And perhaps we can even go to the website and have a look at it together since we have time. Hang on, let me just share that page with you. Okay, so you can see here, this is the website. Well, it has a slew of content, and so then among which is an FAQ on the hydrogen monocyte, and also DHMO and cancer. And so we see all of this. Now, perhaps if you just want to what you would just want to browse through and just look, and maybe you want to look at the way the website was laid out, the information that it portrays. So, okay, should I be concerned about the hydrogen monoxide? And he says, yes, you should be concerned. Okay, although the US government and the CDC do not classify DHMO as a toxic or carcinogenic substance, DHMO is a constituent of many known toxic substances, diseases, and disease-causing agents, environmental hazards, and can even be lethal to humans in quantities as small as a thimbleful. So now it says here that it's a very, very dangerous compound, and we should be very afraid of it. And then they even talk about why haven't you heard of DHMO? And so then it comes up with all this. And so what are some of the dangers associated with DHMO? So now these are the things that most people will be like, okay, I guess I should take note whether I'm in a close proximity to such an environment where I'll be exposed to this compound. So it says that death due to accidental inhalation of DHMO, even in small quantities, prolonged exposure to solid DHMO, causes severe tissue damage. Excessive ingestions produces a number of unpleasant, though not typically life-threatening side effects. So, and it's also a major component of acid rain. So it looks like there's a long list of a lot of things that we should be very concerned about DHMO, right? Now, I just want to bring this back to the slide and ask all of you to just take a look. And now that the website has made these claims, what do you think of them? So accidental inhalation of DHMO can cause death. True or false? Gases DHMO can cause severe burns. True or false? DHMO is used by terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda. True or false? And DHMO is used in chemical weapons manufacture. True or false? Now, perhaps you would want to Google this up to see, and or you want to look back at the website and just to read the explanation that's provided, ask yourself these questions: is this website, are the claims believable? Should we be concerned, and if any of it is true or false? So it's a very brief and short introduction to the misinfo and disinformation landscape. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to ask in the chat right now. And so you can actually have a look at these questions and just take a note of it. This entire session is recorded and will be saved onto the same link that you accessed today. So you can have a look back at it, or you want to take a screenshot of this so that you can do as a little homework, as just to test out how good is your investigative skills. And we'll address all of these questions for this little exercise on Wednesday during our next session. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them down in the comment section. And next is that if you have any feedback at all, please send it, fill in the feedback form. We have a QR code here and also the bit.ly link here. And you would be able to get access to our tip sheet after you fill in the feedback form. Now, if you have any questions about this workshop, you can send it to this email. Otherwise, you can email me with specific questions about the workshop content. And we also have a clinic hour for those who missed the workshops, even this session or the subsequent ones, because for those during the live session, as you can see right now, I can ask you to ask questions and I can respond to it directly. But for those who missed the live session, if you're watching this recording, what you can do, if you still have burning desire to ask questions, you can sign up for our clinic hours. This is the bit.ly link and this is the QR code. We have 2 slots available. You can sign up for either one, whichever that fits the schedule. And now we'll take in questions and I'll bring in Owen as well. If you have any questions, you can just basically ask them on chat right now. Owen, do you have anything to cover?
Yeah, because this first session is quite a short one. So there are a few things I just want to talk about. One of them, of course, being this idea that's become so big in the last few years. And you see a lot of places saying, now we're doing verification, now we're doing fact checking. And there are times that you see verification or fact checking being referred to almost as if it's something separate to journalism. And especially with people coming up through journalism training and education, I think it's very crucial to emphasize early on that this is just another part of journalism, that you can't lose sight of what it is you're actually doing, which is reporting the news from day to day, from week to week, and so on. So it's not different, it's not separate. And strong journalistic fundamental skills and practices and attitudes are as important as ever. And in fact, will serve you well in making you better at this kind of verification and fact-checking work. I saw one of the biggest news agencies in the world a few years ago saying, we are now launching our fact-checking section. And my initial reaction was, you've been reporting the news for 130 years. Have you not started fact-checking until now? Of course, that wasn't what they were saying, but there was very much a fashion toward everyone emphasizing that they were fact-checking what they found online. And this is, of course, something we go back to that Trina explained earlier, that suddenly we have this whole thing of UGC. It's not a term I particularly like. User-generated content basically just means ordinary people's videos and photos. But, I worked for an agency for 6 years that we were very early in on this whole discipline and the use of UGC. And of course, we realized early on that it was almost a slogan for us that there's always someone closer than a journalist. So if you want to report the news quickly, and if you want to get good, compelling content to illustrate it, you will very often be dependent on just an ordinary member of the public. Of course, that means there will be people who don't necessarily have any kind of journalistic mindset and may not be very accurate, sometimes may actually mislead. So this is why this whole verification became a specific field within journalism. We started reporting on this kind of stuff during what came to be known as the Arab Spring. And very early on in places like Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, and others, it became clear that these places were not safe for professional journalists to go in. That meant that we were very much dependent on local people. For example, in Syria, they set up a group of opposition organizations called the local coordinating committees. When order broke down in Syria, these local organizations tried to keep life running as normal in the towns and villages. But of course, they were opponents of the regime. And regardless of whether you agreed with them or not, you had to recognize the fact that they had a specific agenda. And therefore, you had to treat all their content very, very carefully. Now, like I said, it doesn't matter whether you think that's a good agenda or a bad one. It is an agenda, and you will expect their content to be influenced and colored by this. So many of the techniques that I'll be talking to you, and Trina will be talking to you about over the next couple of weeks, were ones that we developed purely out of necessity, because we didn't have a textbook. We didn't have an existing framework. We were just getting all this amazing content, but realizing little by little that we had to treat it with a degree of suspicion and skepticism. So, there's a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. And that's exactly what was happening early on. We were finding things and we had to find ways of checking them. So those experiences and those things that we went through, we will be digging into those over the next couple of weeks and showing you a lot of what we learned in those days. And then as I came to work with a lot of journalists in places like India, Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and so on, we learned more because new experiences are happening all the time. New technology is coming online, things now like deep fakes and so on. So the more I train people about this, the more I teach people about this, the more I learn at the same time. So hopefully I'll be able, and Trina will be able to bring you some of what we have also learned from the people we worked with. And it's quite possible we may learn things from you guys too, because this field changes week by week, month by month. But if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat here, and Trina or I will do our best to give you good answers.
Yes, so we have a few questions. On the first one, I've already responded to Jatin. All sessions are recorded and it will be saved on the exact same link as the live session. So for today's session, it will be saved on this same YouTube link. And for subsequent sessions, you can also just view the subsequent links after the live session is over. You can also view them under the YouTube page, GNI YouTube page under the playlist tab. And the other question that we have is, what do we do when we have media organizations willfully spread this information?
Yes, I was actually frantically scribbling notes about this as Trina was talking, because one of the issues is, of course, when you talk about misinformation and disinformation, that's not just somebody's crazy uncle on Facebook. That could actually be happening at state level. So an issue now is, who do you trust? Who do you recognize as an authoritative source? And you have to look at things like, there's never going to be an easy answer to this, but you have to look at things like who's funding them, who's influencing them. Are they doing it because they're interested parties and that they perhaps support a government or regime? So when media organizations are willfully spreading disinformation, we don't have an easy way around that, but we have to try to hold them up to the same standards of judgment and of correctness. And that means looking at the specifics of what they are reporting. We can't just say, oh, well, they're state funded, therefore what they're saying is nonsense, or they support this party, so we shouldn't believe them. We have to look into the specifics of what they're doing and learn how to analyze and confirm or debunk point by point. And then the other thing that Trina mentioned there, be very judicious and careful in our reporting of that. So if we tell our public, our audience, that this news organization said this and it's incorrect or it's false, we have to be able to very clearly explain to our audience why we know that. We can't just say they're wrong. Nowadays, there's a big issue of trust and engagement between the media and their audience. And people do not expect us to condescend to them now. They expect us to explain clearly why we know what we know. But if we can do that, then it doesn't matter how big the news organization is. If they're wrong, they're wrong. And it's our duty as journalists to call that out. There's another question here. It says, how can we fact check local news? I'm not sure exactly what the thrust of the question is, but I would say in the same way that you check any news, you try to identify what the claims being made are, then figure out what sources you can use to check these claims. And then, as I say, pick them apart point by point, report them in a compelling and believable way, and show that they are true or false. Local news, it may be more difficult sometimes because you may not have the same kind of access to their content that you would with larger news organizations. And yes, the point definitely made there about coronavirus is also another thing, yeah.
We also have other questions about does Google penalize search rankings of sites that stir up fake news or loose rumors?
I don't work directly for Google, so I can't answer that with any authority. I know theoretically, and they say they do. I'm not sure to what extent it works. I think a lot of it is automated, which makes it prone to certain errors and so on. But I can't really speak for Google's motivations and techniques.
I am not quite sure what they do back end, but I do know that tech giants like Google and Facebook do have their own algorithms to actually downrank misinformation. But of course, as Owen mentioned, all this are done by AI, right? And unless it's flagged by a human, then there is no way for us to know if there's an error that has been made. And there are also, yes, there's also a mention of IFCN. So in case those of you who do not know what is IFCN is basically an international fact-checking network. It's a collaboration between multiple, basically, it's a certification as well by multiple agencies, news agencies, and also fact-checking organizations. Their sole work is to actually conduct fact-checking. And if you get an ICN certification as a news outlet, it really lends a lot of credibility to your organization as well, because it says a lot about the work that you do. And that, you know, once an organization has ICN accreditation and they publish an article, we know that, you know, this has been properly fact checked and done, and we can actually then quote that, you know, instead of doing double work and fact checking ourselves, if it's the same information that's circulating online, we can just actually say that this has been debunked by a ICN certified organization XYZ.
Yeah, I think the IFCN thing, sorry, Trina, for cutting across,
Yeah.
the IFCN thing is important in terms of credibility, because it's not just a case that, oh, they have the IFCN stamp, therefore we can believe everything they say. But because the IFCN is quite clear about its requirements for them to get that that imprimatur, that stamp of approval. So you know that if they have the IFCN stamp of approval, they have had to go through certain processes and have had to do their reporting and fact gathering in certain ways. So, you know, there are also things like you have to be able to contact that news outlet, and you have to be able to look at their methodology and so on. So I think the IFCN stamp is helpful in terms of deciding whether somewhere is credible or not.
Okay, so the other question is that, do you think social media accounts or search engines can be more proactive in identifying fake news?
I think they can. I'm not sure I know how they can exactly. I'd be a millionaire if I did know that. One of the issues, of course, is that we are not operating in a vacuum. That you know, we could discuss or argue all day about how good or bad the major platforms are at this and about their motivations and so on. And Clarence makes a good point about, you know, advertising, and somebody else mentioned, you know, clicks and so on. But of course, whether or not they're trying hard enough, whether or not they're competent enough at it, every time they make a change, there are interested actors out there trying to find the loophole, trying to find the way around that. So, like I said, it's not a vacuum. It's a constantly shifting environment, and there's a constant, almost like an arms race or a game of cat and mouse going on. It's like, I always liken it to, you know, the whack-a-mole game where something pops up and you have to smack it down, and then another one pops up somewhere else. This is what mis and disinformation are like. And of course, we know we're not just trying to stop some passive thing happening. There are people actively out there trying to avoid and overcome whatever measures the platforms do take. So, leaving completely aside the issue of their motivations and whether they're trying hard enough and so on, even with the best of intentions and the best of efforts, there's always going to be somebody out there working hard to frustrate that.
Yes, and that also answers the question that Jatin asked in terms of whether platforms are slow in taking steps to mitigate the spread of misinformation. Just as Owen has mentioned, this is basically like an arms race. So we can do whatever we can to combat and counter that, but then there'll always be someone else who comes out with something different and something new each time.
Yeah,
so,
I don't think it's like ideological or judgmental for us to say. You know, I think it's indisputable that they haven't succeeded completely, and I don't think they ever will or can. And there's also the issue of how much they should do, because any of these kind of measures that they take, we have to look at them really carefully and decide, well, could they be put to some other kind of unhealthy use? And the example I'm thinking of is going back a few years when interested actors deliberately made coordinated campaigns to block the kind of information that wasn't good for them. I'm thinking of, for example, videos of atrocities and war crimes that happened in Syria. And there was a group calling themselves the Syrian Electronic Army who deliberately set out to attack these things in a coordinated way. So they would mass report videos of abuses to Facebook, and Facebook's automated system would then remove these videos. And people who investigate war crimes and things like this were aghast at this, because suddenly these things were disappearing forever. So you've got to be very careful when you institute a measure to stop disinformation, to stop bad things happening, that you don't, as the saying goes, throw out the baby with the bathwater, that you don't end up with unintended consequences that may make things even worse.
So we have this other question. I think it's more of a general reporting question that says from Jane. We are normally familiar with local news and international news. Any tips to overcome those barriers in terms of getting familiar with international news? No, as a former journalist, I've done this for 10 years. There is no other way than to regularly do your reading. So I, as a habit, as a journalist habit, I developed this in the early days ever since my first year of reporting was that I had to read at least 4 local news sites and 2 or 3 different international news sites daily, just to browse through the headlines in relation to the area that I'm covering, within Malaysia and also Southeast Asia. So there's no roundabout way, there's no shortcut to this. You have to do it and be diligent about it. And the other question from Jalen is, sometimes states will take more credible international media on tours to get them to put out a particular narrative. How can we fact-check reporting in these instances?
Yeah, it's very difficult when you have a privileged reporting pool, and especially if it seems to you that they're being led around by the nose by governments or other interested actors. I think in that case, there's not a lot you can do directly. You can't say to them, well, don't believe the government, or you can't say to the government, don't take them, take us instead. This is one of the cases in which UGC can be very useful, because very often when you're getting UGC, you're not getting it through the prism or through the lens of the approval of the government or regime. So that's one of the things we used it for a lot, because like I said, in the case of Syria, the government had its supporters who would come in, and they would, and even not their supporters, but people from credible news organizations who would be taken in and specifically show them things that would cast the government in a good light. So this is one of the reasons. It wasn't just to get compelling content, it was to get alternative content that we started looking very carefully at the stuff from the local media activists and so on. And again, just to emphasize that point, when someone is an activist, you have to be careful with their content, regardless of whether you agree with their cause or not. But in the same way, you have to be skeptical of government-approved content, because they obviously also have their own agenda.
I think you have to make your own judgment call when you're on such reporting trips. Obviously, you know that you're being fed a certain narrative, but you will also have to be very, very observant of your surrounding. I think it's something that you develop as a journalist over the years, that when you're being put out on this so-called showcase trips, you would then be observant of the environment around you. And if you're walking around in public spaces, of course, you're followed by the state authorities, but you can also observe the interaction that people have out on the streets with, say, a policeman or a state official or a city hall officer, right? By putting all these observations of what goes on in a daily life, even if you don't get to directly interact with these people because you're being observed, you would be able to more or less be able to get a sense of what's going on the ground. I think that's about it so far with the questions. So if there's nothing more, we'll just remind you that, if you missed this live session, you're watching a recording of this, you can sign up for the clinic hour. And for those who wish to get a tip sheet, we also have a tip sheet, but the requirement to that is that you would need to fill out a feedback form. So we hope you can fill out the feedback form. Your feedback actually matters to us, not because we just want your feedback, but because we're also looking to constantly improve our workshops, and we'll like to know what can be done to make this better in the future. Now, if there's nothing else, I'll say thank you. Have a good evening, and we'll see you again on Wednesday. Take care. Goodbye.
Okay.